All right. Well, I think we'll start. My colleague Danielle will let the latecomers in. So, as some of you may know, James was supposed to be giving his talk, is it 2 weeks ago, possibly 3 weeks ago now, on the 24th of June, I think it was. And sadly, he had a medical emergency that he's now hopefully more or less recovered from, which made it impossible for him to talk on that particular day. So it turns out that his is actually the last of a very interesting series, which I suspect some of you have been listening into, which we've called as the series From Dreyfus to Vichy, Parisian Jewish Arts and Culture in Turbulent Times, which I think actually is very apposite for what James is going to be talking about today. Let me say a little bit about James by way of introduction, first of all. I'm wondering, very curious to know how many of you will have read the book on which this talk is based. I will obviously say more and he will be talking about its subject, but I highly, highly recommend it. It's a wonderful, wonderful piece of work. Anyway, James used to be Paris correspondent for the Washington Post until about 6 months ago, also contributed to the New York Review of Books, received his doctorate from Oxford University in French history, and indeed, I'm right, James, that the topic of the House of Fragile Things is indeed what you were focusing on. He's now based in London, and I've already given the game away. The reason he's here today talking to us as part of the Jewish Renaissance series is that he is indeed the author of this really fabulous and very poignant and informative volume called The House of Fragile Things, Jewish Art Collectors and the Fall of France, which was published by Yale University Press in 2022. But I must also mention that he has another book forthcoming with Yale, you said sometime next year, on Edmund de Rothschild, subtitled Finding Zion, as part of their rather wonderful Jewish Lives series, which many of you may know. And I've just discovered from our conversation just now that he's also got a new project in the pipeline with an interesting title and a very interesting, ambitious topic. It's called, provisionally, Black Milk of Dawn, Jewish Survival and the Fight for Holocaust Memory, which will hopefully, you said, yes, coming out in early next year with Bodley Head in this country and Knopf in the United States. And how enviable, James, that you're now able to devote your life to writing books. Lovely. So without any further comment or further ado, it's my great pleasure to hand over to James, who will be screen sharing for us in a minute.
Right. Well, thank you. Just before I begin, I want to thank Monica so much for having me this evening, and also to the team at Jewish Renaissance for organizing this wonderful series. It is a real privilege to be here with all of you tonight. And again, thank you so much for having me. All right, so let me just make sure that my PowerPoint comes through. Is it working correctly?
Yes, all good, James. That's perfect.
Okay, great. Well, like I said, thank you so much to everybody who has logged in tonight for joining us. And tonight I'm going to be talking about my book, which is, as Monica said, called The House of Fragile Things. And before I get into it, I thought I would just talk a little bit about the general project of the book and how I got into that and how I came to be interested in this topic, which, from afar seems quite niche. So, first things first, despite my extremely Anglo-sounding name, like I am from the United States, but I have a Texan father and a Jewish mother. And was raised sort of what we call in America Reform. And when you travel as a child, that means often visiting Jewish sites wherever you go. And when I was maybe about 10 or 11, one of these sites that I was dragged, at the time it felt like being dragged to see, was the Camondo Museum, which I have no doubt that many of the viewers with us tonight may have been to. It is this kind of jewel box museum on the Parc Monceau in Paris, in the 8th arrondissement, very near to the Arc de Triomphe. And it's a townhouse, a very ornate, elaborate townhouse where you can see one of the sort of most opulent collections of 18th century art and objets d'art that exists. And it is that, it is a, if you were a student, for instance, of Louis XVI, Louis XV, like you absolutely must visit the Camondo Museum because it's one of the best collections that there is that remains intact. But it's also more than that. It's the story of a family, and specifically of the family that collected all of these wonderful pieces. And it is a Jewish story, a very haunting and poignant Jewish story. Moise de Camondo, the patriarch of the Camondo family, who built this collection on the Parc Monceau and the house that it occupies to this day, is the scion of a Sephardic Jewish banking family installed in France as early as the 1860s. And um, as so many Jews of his era, he believed very much in assimilation and acculturation, and really devoted himself to sort of public works in France. And to the extent that his son Nissim de Camondo, after whom the museum is named, died fighting for France in the First World War. And the entire museum was conceived as both a memorial to his fallen son, but really as a sort of love letter to the French nation and all that it had offered the Jews. France was the first country in Europe to have emancipated its Jewish population in 1790, 1791, and during the French Revolution, I should say. And for people like Moise de Camondo, not just Jews but immigrants who had come to the French Republic, and who had been so successful there, it was an amazing experience. And the loss of his son was devastating and shattering, and something that caused him to collect, but also something that really bolstered his sense of belonging in France. The museum it really comes out of that. And anyway, I'm rambling, but one generation later, Moise's daughter, Beatrice de Camondo, is murdered in Auschwitz, deported from France via the Drancy camp outside Paris with her husband, or her by then ex-husband, and two children, where they are all murdered. And the museum today tells this story very, very well. But when I first went to it as a child, it didn't. And I was fascinated by sort of what wasn't being said about the house and the people that had built it, and all that it represented. And I knew even then at that young age that it was something that I would write about one day. And indeed, when it came time to do my PhD in history, this was the topic that I chose. Now, it wasn't the story of just one family, I should say. And, Fragile Things became a bigger project because in looking into the story of the Camondo, I realized that, in fact, what is so striking is that they are one of a number of families that are all intermarried and linked, and sort of crossed every which way, of a veritable social world of these Jewish families that all um, were so invested in the politics, in the culture, and in the sort of international standing of France in this extremely turbulent time between the two world wars, that all left a collection, or a house museum of some kind, to the state in gratitude before the Second World War. And that struck me as so interesting, right? The fact that each of these Jewish families would essentially, bequeath to this country that in the end would turn on all of them so savagely, all their worldly goods and possessions. And that's what you see with the Camondo Museum in Paris, but also with the Champs-sur-Marne Chateau, which we'll talk about in a minute, outside Paris, with the Villa Carolus in the south of France, and with the Villa Efroussi de Rothschild also in the south of France. And it became this sort of bigger project, and that was the genesis of the book. And what do I try to do with the book? Well, on the one hand, I am not a trained art historian. I did sort of normal history. So I am not a specialist in the particular objects or paintings involved, but I'm extremely interested in, um, to the extent possible, resuscitating any traces of these women and men who left these collections behind. Because in my mind, collecting is it's a fascinating and somewhat universal human tendency that tells us quite a lot, both about individual people who collect, but also the times in which the collectors operate. Because on some level, collecting is both deeply intimate and psychological. What are we drawn to? What interests us in a given moment in time is surely an expression of who we are on some fundamental level. And of course, people relate to objects in ways they don't relate to anything else in their lives. It's very intimate, it's very tactile, and it's very emotional. But also, collecting is fundamentally social as much as it is psychological. So, the whole notion of taste, and there is a huge body of writing about this from a theoretical perspective. But taste is fundamentally a function of a time and place, right? So, what people choose to prize as distinct and as coveted in a given moment in time is is distinctly a product of where they are in the world and what social station they occupy. And and the characters in the House of Fragile Things are no exception. So in France, between the Dreyfus affair and the dawn of the Vichy government, the Second World War, the highest watermark was the sort of 18th century ancien regime aesthetic, right? The fête galante, the paintings of Boucher and Fragonard, Louis XVI furniture, Louis XV furniture, that sort of thing. And that is what these collectors prized most, because in doing so, they were projecting an image of Frenchness to the outside world, people who otherwise didn't believe that Jews could be French. And what I think is really poignant about this is that these collections before the war meant one thing, and after the war they mean something totally different. And all of us can go to these museums which remain intact, even though their authors were either murdered themselves or their families were, and see something that looks very different than what the collectors would have seen. And so that interplay between history and memory is something that also interests me very much. Now, from a strictly scholarly point of view, another argument that I try to make in the book is about the way in which anti-Semitism functioned in the fin de siècle. So, and trying to argue that art and sort of aesthetics and material culture in general were fundamental to the way in which Jews were attacked and otherized in the France of the fin de siècle leading up to the Second World War. And I'll talk more specifically about this, but I try to argue in the book, and I will let all of you be the judges of how successful that argument is made, but that Jews were cast as ersatz citizens, as sort of facsimiles of Frenchmen and French women, by at least the elites, by how sort of fake their collections were, and how in poor taste their homes were, and sort of the material realm becomes, in a sense, the battlefield for the soul of a nation. And that's a theme that I try to pursue in the book, which is that, like, art and objects and these very, very fine pieces are not peripheral. In fact, they're central to conceptions of nationhood and identity in the period. And um, that's something that these collectors and their families lived intimately. And again, like I said, we know how the story ends, but they did not. And for a time, they really felt like they had won that battle. And it's of course devastating to see that, in fact, it was otherwise. Um, but most importantly, I see the House of Fragile Things as a work of microhistory, and it is about restoring, to the best we can, the lives of, and the traces, more rather, of, these individuals who lived in an impossible moment, truly impossible moment that that had, a level of hateful invective that I think it's very difficult for people in our generation to understand, or our moment, I should say, to understand, and who, nevertheless, despite all of that, tried to make something beautiful out of it. And they succeeded in that. And what they created that was beautiful was the collections, of course, which are still intact today because they were all given to the state before the Holocaust. But more than that, it was a reverie on the French Jewish encounter, and of what it meant to be a minority in a so-called universalist society, and they came up with, a really incredible way of doing that. And I find it very moving, and I hope that all of you will as well. Um, and tonight, I will tell one story in the book, which, you can see on the screen, begins with one particular portrait. And I'm sure that many of you will know this image. It is a very well-known image, and it is a Renoir portrait from 1880, 1881 of a young woman named Irene Candenver, who is, one of the red threads that I follow throughout the book. Okay, so Irene Candenver is the daughter of one of the wealthiest French Jewish families of her time. The Candenver family are the progenitors of the bank that today is Paribas, BNP. And so fabulously wealthy, extremely Parisian, very dialed into all the sort of right salons of culture, the arts, literature. Proust came to dinner, that kind of thing. So it does not get more elite than this. And in the 1880s, in the sort of early days of the Third Republic, Mrs. Candenver, at the suggestion of her lover, Charles Effersey, who figures prominently in, Edmund Duval's The Hare with Amber Eyes, as I'm sure many of you will know, commissioned Renoir to paint portraits of her three daughters, and Irene's is in profile before you. And this is a photo that I found in the National Archives in Paris of the real life Irene Candenver, which I love because it's also in profile, and it shows you a sense of the real, young woman, that Renoir tried to depict. So I'll show you just one more time. Yeah. And this portrait that Renoir created, almost instantly it became a sensation. It became an image that was beloved. And this is an etching of the painting from, the Gazette des Beaux-Arts, the journal that Charles Effersey edited at the time. And it became a kind of cult status image, and it said something about femininity, it said something about youth, and it said something about beauty, and also, with the presence of the ivy, it says a lot about, this kind of Edenic, the return to the Garden of Eden and the innocence and sort of euphoria of unspoiled youth. And so I think, then as now, the portrait has this afterlife, and we'll talk a little bit about the afterlife later. But it became something instantly bigger than the particular young woman whom it depicted, and she had a very different life than what one might have suspected of, of a subject of such a painting. These are her parents, Louis and Louise Candenver. Like I said, the sort of, creators of a real dynasty in Paris, and a real salon that you could not be in the world of culture in Paris and not pass through those doors at the time. And they had everybody worth knowing was at their house. And specifically, they had an image of how life should be for elites, and they guarded that fiercely. And that involved distinct gender roles, especially for women. And it's interesting that that I'm showing you portraits. These are portraits by Bonnat and Carolus Durin, respectively, of Mr. and Mrs. Candenvers. Renoir painted the daughter. Each of the portraits, displayed in the home, displays a certain sense of social expectation and of bourgeois sort of social ritual, if you will. And this notion of bourgeois femininity was something that Irene Candenvers, the real life sitter, could never accept, and that she would rebel against dramatically her whole life. Like I said, this is a picture of Proust. Proust was a confidant and friend of Mrs. Candenvers, specifically the letters of the letters of Proust, edited by the great literary historian Philip Kolb, feature a lot between the Candenvers household and Proust. That's just a sort of brief aside, but it gives you a sense of, if you've read the incredible novel, but also social testament that is À la recherche du temps perdu, you have a sense of the world that we're talking about. I mean, this is the world of glittering dinners, balls, all of that, and that a lot of it happened in the Candenvers household. And speaking of that household, to give you a sense of the kind of built environment and aesthetic milieu, this is the living room of the Château de Champs-sur-Marne, and that's the Candenvers house outside Paris, about an hour to the east. And you'll see that it's an homage to the 18th century. And what's noteworthy about this particular house is this is not new construction. The Chateau de Champs has a truly illustrious history, and in buying it and in refurbishing it, the Candenvers, I mean, this is a house that it had in previous centuries Chateaubriand and Madame de Pompadour, and all of these kind of illustrious guests from the French past in these rooms. And by buying it and restoring it, the Candenvers were, in my argument, were showing that Jews could be as French as the French, if not more so. And essentially were writing themselves into what the French call the roman national, the national novel, and saying that, we are loyal custodians of the French past. And in fact, we fit into the French national story as much as anyone else. And more than that, we have a right to be here. As much as anybody else does. And, like I mentioned earlier in my little introduction, that the 18th century style was the sort of high watermark of society at that time. I mean, this is why for Jews it meant a little bit more than it meant for other people, because it was a way of saying that you belonged. There was a lot at stake, and you can see that aesthetic here. And the Camondo house, which we'll talk about in a minute, has even more of that. Now, who is this bearded man on the screen? This is a man called Edouard Drumont, and he is arguably, before Hitler, one of the most vehement anti-Semites in the history of modern Europe, and certainly in modern France. And, I mentioned in the previous slide how contested aesthetics could be, and also in my introduction. And it was Drumont who was the leading anti-Semite of the French fin de siècle, and who wrote this his best-selling anti-Semitic tract called La France Juive, Jewish France, in 1886. That was a wild runaway bestseller, and that, by the way, made the fortune of the French publishing house Flammarion, which is still around today and is still a big deal. And Drumont's argument, while all about all about the sort of alleged Jewish invasion of France, was largely made through the language of art and objects and material culture. And this is one of the things that I try to argue in the book, following in the footsteps of great historians who have also written on this topic, such as Tom Stammers, and Philip Nord and others, which is saying that, or sorry, which is all a means of saying that, look, the language of anti-Semitism in particular moments is really important because this historic hatred manifests itself differently in different moments. And in the fin de siècle, this incredibly material world, the language with which the Jewish elite and power structure, such as many of the families in my book, who were not just collectors, but were also parliamentarians, bankers, museum board members, etc., this is how they were attacked. And it really is important to pay attention to that to understand what it was that they were actually facing and how they dealt with it. And Drumont's attacks on them were relentless, truly, and he attacked them by name in his book, but also in the anti-Semitic newspaper that he edited called La Libre Parole, which translates as free speech, which sort of tells you all that you need to know. And he hounded them, and he never sort of let up. So this was, in the background of their lives, this kind of constant trickle that they had to, and at some points more than a trickle, certainly during the Dreyfus affair. But it was always there, and there was no escaping it. And this is why I really became fascinated by collecting, because on the one hand, it, like I said, it's social but also psychological. It's You get the sense that for many of these great Jewish collectors in this period, that the collections that they created were real sanctuaries and solaces from this sort of intolerable world outside on the street. And it becomes increasingly poignant the more of the letters and sort of private diaries of the families that one reads. Okay, enough on Drumont. He will be there throughout this story. But this is the second Renoir portrait that Mrs. Cannes-d'Anvers commissioned of her daughters, and these are two other Cannes-d'Anvers daughters, Alice and Elizabeth. And Elizabeth Cannes-d'Anvers, who is in blue right here, is ultimately deported and murdered in Auschwitz about 50 years later. So it's a devastating and still sadly little known story. And this portrait, by the way, is in Sao Paulo, in the big museum there in Brazil. And this is Alice Cannes-d'Anvers, who marries a British man, Sir Edward Townsend, and then lives in London for the rest of her life. Okay. Now, first of all, before I continue, I apologize for the extremely complicated family tree and sort of intermingled branches situation here, and also for the fact that so many of the characters in the book are named Leon and Beatrice. But there is a family tree in the beginning of the book, and I will do my best to sort of explain it all clearly. But I am telling you tonight the story of Irene Cannes-d'Anvers, and this is the man that Irene Cannes-d'Anvers was forced to marry. So, I spoke a little bit about the kind of bourgeois expectation of women, and part of that was marriage. And Irene was married off at the age of 19 to a 31-year-old man, this man in particular, Moïse de Camondo, who was from a Sephardic banking family from Istanbul, or at the time Constantinople, and who was a business associate and sometime partner of her father, Louis Cannes-d'Anvers. And, it's difficult to underscore now how different the two families could have been. I mean, for one, the Camondo were Sephardic, and, Irene was born in Paris and very French, but Moïse, pictured here, was born in Istanbul and, only came to France as a young man. And so, very different in many respects. He also, the Camondos were Orthodox, and the Cannes-d'Anvers were observant but not Orthodox, and just very different in terms of their Jewishness as well. And almost immediately, it was a very unhappy marriage, and it was that sort of very kind of fin de siècle scripted life of a woman and wife that Irene um, tried to flee almost instantly. And essentially, the world that, or the future that was prescribed by her in the portrait that her mother had commissioned of her as a little girl, you know, this sort of paragon of beauty, this avatar of feminine grace was something that she just had no time for and no interest in, and that she desperately tried to escape. And you know, I mentioned a little bit about the 18th century in the 18th century style in my remarks on her parents' house, but this is a photo of the Salon des Huet in the Musée Camondo. Huet being the great 18th century painter, and this is a room that Moïse de Camondo painstakingly designed to fit 6 panels by Huet. And you know, this is in my mind the best example of the kind of late 19th century, early 20th century affinity in France of the 18th century style. And it you know, it's monarchical. It alludes to the court of Versailles. You know, people loved items that had once belonged to Marie Antoinette. Anyway, um, it's also, it goes to show you a sense of like what it was like for the young Irene to marry into this kind of life, into a world in which her husband obsessed over every little object and sought to sort of, you know, exert that kind of control on the physical space around him, but also on the people in his life, including her. And I think that it was intolerable for her living as though as a wife and woman, as though she was yet another art object to be controlled and ordered according to someone else's vision, never her own. And to that end, eventually she had enough. And this is a photo of Irene. That's her as kind of middle aged. And Irene and Moise had 2 children, Nissim, the namesake of the museum right here, and Beatrice, her daughter, later murdered in Auschwitz. But then um, she eventually leaves Moise de Camondo because she falls in love with an Italian man who runs the Camondo stables in the house. And this causes a huge kerfuffle in Paris in the fin de siècle. She is written about in the newspapers. She is humiliated. She is disowned by her parents, who are appalled that she would embarrass them this way and run off with not only somebody who worked in the Camondo stables, but somebody who is not Jewish. He was Catholic. She converted to Catholicism to marry him. They get married in a church. It's a whole sort of scandal. And Moise fights her bitterly for custody of her children, and he wins on the grounds that their religious education is really important to continue. And this goes on and on. Anyway, she has another child named Claude Sampieri, who is the young girl here with Claude Sampieri, or sorry, with this guy named Sampieri, who is the Camondo stableman. And this is a source of embarrassment and humiliation for Moise de Camondo for the rest of his life. But this gives you a sense of the sort of turbulent and tumultuous private life that Irene Candomber was embroiled in, beginning very early on. Um, as I mentioned, you know, the story of the Camondo house is particularly poignant because it is donated to the state in honor of Nissim de Camondo here, who, as an older man, fights for France in the Air Force and then dies behind enemy lines over Lorraine in 1917. And you know, he was his father's pride and joy, the apple of daddy's eye. And it's after Nissim's death that Moise really sequesters himself from everything and begins to collect exclusively. So collection and you know the material culture of the objects becomes yeah, a refuge, and like I said earlier, a solace from the pain that he was feeling. But also, collecting becomes a barricade against the public humiliation of his divorce from Iran and the disruption that that had caused in Jewish Paris at the time. But Iren continues living her life on her own terms, and here she is, a free woman later in life, at the wedding of her stepdaughter, and her daughter Beatrice de Camondo is here behind her, and she really was a sort of force to be reckoned with in Paris all throughout her days, and she kind of kept true to her promise to herself, which was to you know be done with the world of her birth in many respects, and to create a life entirely of her own choosing. And she paid deeply for it, but she did achieve that. Now, that was all pre-war, and now we arrive in the summer of 1940. France falls to the Germans in a matter not of months, not of weeks, but of days, and it's a spectacular collapse, a strange defeat, to quote the historian Mark Bloch, and it happens so quickly that it defies even the most cynical observers' expectations. And almost immediately, the question becomes for many of these Jewish families, but also of the custodians of France's great cultural institutions, what is going to happen to the art and the objects? And the Nazis placed a keen emphasis on material culture as well. So, like I mentioned earlier, these questions are not peripheral; they are central to our understanding of the Nazi war effort, but also of the way that Jews experienced the war. Because at every level, and I'm talking here about the highest level, of course, of sort of social class, like the Camondos, the Candomblé, that sort of thing. But at every level, the Nazi attempt to humiliate and liquidate the Jewish community was fundamentally linked to spoliation and to material destruction. So, taking the objects that Jews collected, that they had, even collections that were not worth much, or even just ordinary objects in ordinary people's homes, was central to the destruction, to the project of destroying a people, because only by getting rid of the traces of the people could the people truly be, in the eyes of the Nazis, forgotten. And that is what makes some of these sites so devastating to visit, is knowing that that was the intention. Now, the Louvre Museum is targeted almost instantly, and that's a photo of what I'm showing you right now on screen. Um, Now, what happens to specific collections is very interesting. So, for instance, the Renoir portrait that I showed you of Irene Candomvert, what happens to it during the war? Okay, so lots of photos on the screen. This man here is a man called Jacques Jaujard, who works for the French National Monuments Commission during the war, and who is largely responsible, and the Louvre, and largely responsible for protecting so many of the Louvre's own collection, but also the collections of Jewish collectors, by sending them for safekeeping to Chambord, the Chateau de Chambord, this lovely Renaissance chateau here that many of you, I'm sure, have visited. And inside is a picture of a lot of the holdings that it had during the war. And the portrait of Irene Candomvert is given to Jacques Jaujard for safekeeping in, I believe, 1941. Uh, and it goes to Chambord. And ultimately, the Nazis do arrive in Chambord. Jaujard is not able to save everything, and the portrait is taken by the Nazis from there, and it's sent to Germany, where for a time it actually enters the collection of Hermann Goering himself. Now, what happens to the rest of the family? Now, okay, the portrait of Irene Candomvert, I should say, has an interesting sort of family history to it, in the sense that Mr. and Mrs. Candomvert, who had commissioned the portrait in the 1880s, absolutely hated what Renoir had come up with. And as a wedding present, they gave it to their granddaughter Beatrice de Camondo. Here she is as a grown woman, um, and this is her husband, Leon Reinach, the scion of another great French Jewish family, very central to the cultural life of the Third Republic. And the portrait hangs in Beatrice's apartment in Neuilly-sur-Seine, just outside Paris, in kind of place of pride in the living room. And so it was from her home that, it had gone to Georgard and to Chambord, and from there that had been taken. Um, and it was by all accounts, Iren was a kind of absent mother, especially after she remarried and had a new family with her second husband. And Beatrice and her brother Nissim felt, from the records that survived, somewhat abandoned by her. And the portrait of her mother was, a prized possession, right, of the absent mother from her life. And during the war, Beatrice and her husband, again, we there's so much that we don't know. And I did my very best in the book to try and recast the archives to the best of my ability. But I know that they were divorced at some point in early 1942, and that the reason was allegedly because of Leon's infidelities. I know that Beatrice had converted to Catholicism and apparently was not as a convert just seeking sort of distance from her Jewish roots, that she genuinely uh, believed the Catholic doctrine, which I must admit I was surprised by, and I'll get more into that in a minute. But they ultimately are they leave Paris like many people do in the summer of 1940. They go to Arcachon outside of Bordeaux, and then ultimately they come back, and they seem to really think that somehow they will be saved. That their connections and the fact that her brother died fighting for France in the First World War, and that her father has given this fabulous museum to the state as a gesture of gratitude, will somehow save them from the fate that befell so many other Jews. And she really lingers in that delusion for a very long time, too long, it turns out. Um, this is a portrait of Beatrice's aunt, Elizabeth Candenver, who I showed you her portrait before, is the young girl in blue. And as a very old woman, she was in hiding in the French countryside in the Loire, where she's ultimately discovered and arrested by local authorities and deported to Drancy and Auschwitz, where she is murdered. Now, I mentioned about Beatrice's conversion. I just had to include this to show you because it was one of those moments in my research for the book that it just sort of took my breath away. I mean, this is, doing this kind of history is, um, you know, a lot of the time you were in archives looking at things that other people have seen, or that, are administrative records of this or of that, that don't really tell you all that much, or that tell you just a tiny, tiny little thing that just isn't that interesting. And you kind of have to turn every page and hope that you have some clarity on something. And a lot of it's grunt work. It doesn't really feel like you're accomplishing anything. And how will you ever know anything about your topic or your subject? Or how can you possibly understand the people? And the truth is, you really can't. Other people are fundamentally unknowable, which is the great lesson of this kind of work. And this letter is proof of why. So, at one juncture during my research, I had the kind of dream of any historian, which is to sort of be put in touch with a very old man who lives in Neuilly, whose mother had been friends with Beatrice de Camondo in childhood. And he very kindly received me in his living room. And, it's full of exactly the kind of furniture in the Camondo house. It kind of fits the part. And we start talking about Beatrice, and I tell him about my interest in the topic and so on and so forth. And he goes, I have two letters that she wrote to my mother. Would you like to see them? And I said, yes, I would. And he very graciously opened up this beautiful slant top desk, pulls out these two letters, and let me read them. And one of them was written during the Second World War, or sorry, during the First World War, when her brother had died, and it's very moving about all that he had meant to her and so on and so forth. The second, though, and this is what I have a picture of on the screen, it's chilling. It's written 3 months to the day before she was arrested by the Nazis. And so, by the way, she was arrested by the Nazis in December 1942. Uh, September 1942 is already a truly terrible time to be a Jew in France. In July of 1942 was the now world famous Veldiv roundup, when Parisian Jews were sent to a sporting arena on the site of nearby what is now the Eiffel Tower, it was the Eiffel Tower was then too, but the sporting complex is no more. But it was in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower over there in that part of the river, and well into the period when you had to wear the yellow star. But Beatrice somehow in September after that thinks that because she is a convicted Catholic, truly enamored with Jesus and the Virgin Mary, that she will be saved and spared the fate of other Jews. And this letter details all of that. And it's just, I have to admit, before I saw this, I didn't really believe, a lot of Jews converted to Catholicism in those years as a sort of doomed insurance policy. And as a Jew myself, I just didn't really believe that anybody saw anything in Catholicism or that anybody could in that moment. But she proves to be an exception, and she really, really believed in the Catholic faith. And part of writing her story and remembering her means honoring that and honoring how she saw herself. And that was a lesson for me, which is, as I said before, how truly unknowable and how complicated every other person always is. And this is my favorite photograph of her, of Beatrice, and I have it because, in my mind, I love the continuity of the women in profile between her mother in the Renoir portrait and the photo of her mother from the National Archives that I found, and this one from the Camondor Archives. It's these women in portrait looking into the distance, and in this case, it's the sort of opacity of the entire profile that I find really chilling, because it gets into, all that we don't know about this mysterious woman who, after years of following the traces of her, I feel like I only scratched the surface. And of course, what happened to her is devastating and unspeakable. And Beatrice and her husband and two children were all murdered in Auschwitz in 43 and 44. And what is especially poignant is that Beatrice is the last of them to die. She makes it until 2 weeks before the Soviets arrive in Auschwitz. She lasted a very long time in both Drancy and in Auschwitz, in unspeakable conditions. And the photograph gets, I think it suggests, all that we don't know about this fascinating person and still don't know. Um, Now, back to the painting. It was discovered, the portrait of Irene Candelvera, rather. It was rediscovered by the Allies after the war. It passes through the central collection point in Munich, and it ends back up in Paris after the fact. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. And it ends back up in Paris after the fact. And that's really interesting because there was a show at the Jeu de Paume curated by the heroic Rose Valland, where you had all of these stolen masterpieces on public display, essentially for survivors or family members to come and say, oh, that one was mine, or that belonged to my grandfather, or so on and so forth, to begin the process of restitution, however possible. And the portrait of Irene Candelvera is no exception. And the real life Irene Candelvera happened to be able to go to that show, and she sees the portrait of herself on the wall, and she says to the authorities, that's me, that's my portrait. Now, the reality was it technically wasn't. It was her daughter's property, not her own property. It had belonged to her parents and to her daughter, but because Beatrice and Beatrice's children had all been murdered, and because she was the sitter, she was granted the portrait back. Now, what does she do with it then? Now, this is the part that was the hardest for me to grapple with, because what happens is a very sad and very dark story. Um, I'll come back to my previous slide. Just one second. Irene gets the portrait, and then almost immediately sells it, which is her right, of course. And it is not uncommon that many survivors or family members got rid of items or artworks that reminded them of their loved ones who had been murdered. That's very common. But the problem is who Irene sold her portrait to, and he is pictured here in this slide, which is the industrialist Emil Burla, who was essentially a Nazi arms dealer. He was German-born, naturalized Swiss, who, provided war material to the Axis powers, and specifically Nazi Germany during the war. And I should point out that Burla, who loved art, was a collector and who bought many items on the black market in Paris during the war, including from the famous collection of Paul Rosenberg, the grandfather of Anne Sinclair, and was forced after the war by Paul Rosenberg himself to give back what he had procured under dubious terms. And so, clearly a very shady character in every way. But what is complicated is that Irene's portrait is Burla's legally fair and square, because the legal claimant, at least in the eyes of the French government, of the portrait sold it legally to a Nazi collaborator. So you have this really horrible situation in which the prized possession of a Holocaust victim, of Beatrice de Camondo, is the legal property of the Burla collection, and it's still there in Zurich today. So it is in kind of this was from the show of it in the Musée Mayol. And I should say that the Kunsthaus in Zurich, which has taken a lot of the Burla collection, has done a fabulous job in recent years contextualizing it and telling the story. For years and years they didn't, but it's still very uncomfortable to see this portrait of Irene in the hands of a collection with this history. But that is where it remains. Now, this is the real life Irene Candenver, who this is taken in the early 1960s before she died in 1963. And again, it's very difficult to understand, what motivated this woman who all her life, as a young woman, as the sort of divorcee that rocked Jewish Paris and the fin de siècle, as a mother who abandoned her family, as a young woman who wanted a life of her own, and then as a survivor who made, so to speak, a deal with the devil. She remains a mystery. There's so much about her that we do not know and that we will never know. And her story kind of haunts the painting that has become a kind of commonplace image. And to that end, I will just return us to this slide where I'll end. This is a screenshot from the famous Godard film Breathless from the early 60s. In fact, just before Irene died. And this is Jane Seberg in front of a poster of the painting in the apartment of her lover. And at one point in the film, Seberg asks her lover, like, who is prettier, me or the girl in the painting? Well, in the film, the girl in the painting has no name and no identity and no context. And, what I try to do in Fragile Things is restore some of that story to the best of my ability, of not just Irene, but of the whole world that she represented, and of the questions that it poses for us today. And with that, I will end, and will be happy to answer any questions that any of you may have.
Thank you very much, James. As fully expected, that was wonderfully engaging and eloquent, and indeed thought-provoking as well.
Well,
Shows
thank you.
how taking, yes, the sort of focusing in on one family or a cluster of families can speak so eloquently of much bigger issues as well. Thank you very much indeed. Right, there's at least one question, which I think was a rather astute one as I glimpsed it coming in. If anybody else would like to ask something, either if you prefer to just put up your virtual hand, that's absolutely fine, or equally do type it in. While you have the chance. So I've got quite a few things I'd like to ask or comment on, but let's start with Barbara Elton's question, which I think is a really to the point one. And I don't think you can see it. She says, to what extent do you think what happened to these families and their collections is a uniquely French experience?
A very good question. So the whole story of Jews and art in Europe during the Holocaust is not distinct to these families. What is distinct is the way that these, I mean, I chose the characters in the book based on those who had donated a collection to the state of more or less the same type of art or furniture, etc. Um, before the war for a specific reason. So and that part I think is distinct. I mean, you have Jewish philanthropists all over Europe. You have a whole huge, vast literature of Jews and modernism. And, I mentioned Paul Rosenberg, but, Jewish dealers and et cetera were very invested in that story, and that's a different story. I mean, like people like Kahnweiler, the list goes on and on and on. But what is distinct in the French case, I would venture, is this sort of absolute fidelity, not just to the values of the kind of French past and the French Republic, but also to its ideology. And they really, really believed that it was a sort of totally immersive experience, right? That being French and that being a proud French immigrant meant collecting a specific type of art. So this was also the era, as I just said, and as many of you know, that um, the likes of Paul Rosenberg were supporting Picasso and Braque and modernist stuff. That all of these people were very reluctant to come anywhere near, because in their mind it jeopardized what they were really doing with their collections, which was planting a flag in the sand and saying, "This is me. I am French. I am a loyal custodian of this country." Now, of course, I mean, again, the Jewish experience my work has been mostly on France, but I'm well aware about the Jews in Germany and the Jews in Poland and so on and so forth. And there are these stories elsewhere, but the French case has a real drama to it in that regard, in terms of like living the aesthetics of the nation that one strives to assimilate into. And I think that is distinct to my knowledge, but I mean, I could be wrong.
Thanks. Any other questions? Perhaps while you're thinking, let me just chip in. All sorts of things come to mind. Perhaps I could start with the relationship between the dealers and the collectors you've been examining.
Mm-hmm.
As you know, Charles Delheim gave a talk based on
Yes.
his magisterial book on the Jews in the art world, focusing mostly on those who made the art world modern, as he put it in his title. But I'm just curious to know whether there is a correlation between the figures you've been concentrating in your book and the dealers who provided them with the art and artifacts that inhabited their houses.
Yes, there is. I mean, I think that Charles Delham's book does an excellent job in explaining the role of the dealers in this cosmology. I mean, his book sort of does everything, right? It's the artist, it's the collectors, it's the dealers, it's the whole ecosystem. In this specific case, um, dealers like Seligman, for instance, are hugely important in the story and become kind of close confidants of the likes of Moïse de Camondo. And there is a huge, rich correspondence between Seligman and Camondo in the archives of the museum that I encourage any of you interested to consult and to read, because it really shows that for someone like Moïse de Camondo, the dealer figure was not just somebody who sold you ormolu clocks or whatever it was you were looking for, but somebody who helped you define a taste and somebody who helped you define, in a sense, your sort of public position in a very fraught social environment. And the dealer becomes a kind of guide, and because like I mentioned before, taste is fundamentally social and it doesn't come from a vacuum, and so the dealers are the ones who are helping a lot of these collectors along the way, and a lot of them also are Jews from similar backgrounds as the collectors themselves.
Mm.
It turns out, not all, but
Not
a
all.
number.
Yeah, no, that's
Yeah.
figures, isn't it? Right, I'm still looking, casting a glance at the chat, nothing coming through just yet. One thing that occurred to me as I read your book already a while ago, but also revisiting it now, and I don't think it's something you necessarily address or certainly don't stress in your account of all this, but why was it that they chose pre-Second World War to make these extraordinarily generous donations to the French state?
Mm.
What's significant about the timing of that, do you think?
Yeah, I think you know it's really interesting. I mean, there's no definitive answer to
No,
that.
sure, yeah.
My sense is that it was a means of, look, historians like Philippe Landau have called the First World War the so-called apogee of the Israelite, and the Israelite, by the way, being the kind of French Jewish ideal of the late 19th century and early 20th century, i.e., the proud Jewish citizen who was first and foremost a citizen of the Republic and a Jew at home and private, but above all else, a loyal servant and soldier of the Republic. And I think that coming after the First World War, that's very important because it was a way of showing loudly and proudly, but maybe not loudly, but proudly and sort of elegantly, that one could be exactly like an Israelite de coeur, as the French would be. So that I am so much invested both in my own identity and in the collective of this social construct that is the French Republic, that I'm going to leave the extent of my collection to the state, but it's going to be under a Jewish name, so that like the visitors will have to see that the Camondo Museum is where you come to see the glories of France, and I think it has a lot to do with that. And I mean, again, like the sourcing on that is kind of complicated, but I relied heavily on wills and testaments, in which, and I quote a lot of those in the book, but there is a lot to suggest that that's how at least the benefactors saw their projects. And of course, what a collector and what a donor thinks of whatever he or she leaves behind is one thing, and how the public interacts with it is another. And they most of the collectors that left these museums to France all died before the Holocaust or just at the very beginning of it. So they didn't really live to see how bad things would get or what would happen to their families. And one wonders what Moise de Camondo would have made of the fact that the country that he is obsessed with thanking and being publicly grateful for deported his daughter and grandchild and grandchildren. But the point is, he doesn't know, and that's what makes visiting these places so incredibly shattering.
I suppose there's also a further irony that had they not made those donations pre-war, then those wonderful places like the Camondo Museum would not today be public, sort of,
Right.
in a sense, they would not probably have survived in the form that they did survive. So,
Right.
sort of, yes, goodness, many, many interesting things to think about here. I'm looking at the time. Anybody else would like to ask something? Now is your chance. What else might one say? You mentioned, perhaps just the last question, that when you first visited them, you're only 10, I think, but when you visited the Musée du Commando as a youngster, it didn't mean much to you. There was nothing on the walls to actually indicate this wonderful but also very dark story. And you said that things have changed. And I wonder if you might just tell us a little bit more about what has actually changed in terms of the display and the kind of articulation of these histories.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So, I mean, I don't know. I can't remember off the top of my head exactly which year all of this changed, but between, the year 2000, say, around that time when I first came, and present day, yeah, there's been a huge amount of information put in about the family. What is just as important to the core kind of exhibition and visit that visitors pursue in the museum is the private apartments upstairs, and you get a sense of the real people who live there. And it ends with this very moving sort of story about the Camondo and what happened to them. Um, and it does as good of a job as any as it could of telling that story. And I think that they deserve a lot of credit for that. Um, and it's very difficult to tell that story though in that kind of extremely gilded and opulent space. But it has it's a bit like the Finzi Contini story. It has a little bit of that to it. But I think they do a wonderful job. And I should also point out, mine is not the only book on this topic. And in recent years, there have been some other things, especially in French, on the story, and that's very good as well. I mean, so there was a novel, but or not a novel, but a popular historical book by the wonderful writer Pierre Assouline in French, kind of the first to look at the Camondo story. The wonderful Edmond Duval has done a book on the Camondo, although it's very creative and inventive in a way that only he could do. It's these beautiful imaginary letters between himself and Moise de Camondo. Um, uh, anyway, there have been other studies that have and other kind of attempts to sort of address the story in different avenues outside of history, qua history, that do it real justice. And I think the museum is part of that.
You mentioned Tom Stammers, and I don't know, perhaps in the audience you might be interested
Absolutely.
to know of this fabulous project that he's initiated together with Abigail Green and at Oxford, called the Jewish Country Houses Project, which is very international. And indeed, there is a strong Holocaust element to some of the stories that are being told by means of this project. Again, looking at these opulent lives in opulent places, but actually probing the significance of their Jewish connections. It's a wonderful project and very good website if you'd like to pursue that
It
further.
really is.
Really, really.
Absolutely.
Um, and I think perhaps we should call it a day. It's getting late, isn't it?
Mhm.
But just to say, since you did, or I was going to say it anyway, but since you mentioned the Reinach family and also the Efrussi extraordinary villa down in the south of France, that as some of you may already know, I have actually helped Jewish Renaissance organize a trip looking at Jewish art and culture in the south of France for early November, the 4th to the 10th of November this
Oh,
very year, which will, of course, visit both those wonderful places with their rich Jewish related history. So do
fabulous.
check the website, the Jewish Renaissance Tours website, if you're interested in finding out more. So I think it's, yes, thank you, Danielle. We've got the link in the chat there. James, thank you very much indeed. I hope those of you who haven't yet read his book, The House of Fragile Things, incidentally, is it a quotation or is it a phrase that you yourself coined?
It's not a quotation. I
No.
have to say,
Um,
I must give credit to my wonderful editor at Yale Press, Julian Luce, who came up with it.
no.
It's not my invention; it's his. So, but I'll take it.
You can take it. It's a good title.
All
Anyway, so
right.
yes, it's obviously still available. Please go out and purchase a copy. Lovely,
Yeah.
good. Thank you everybody
Well,
for
thank
listening.
you so much for having
James,
me
thank
tonight,
you,
to
and I'm so
Monica,
glad
and
that
to
you were
all of you for being here. I really appreciate it, and I
lovely.
wish
Many,
you a
many
wonderful
thanks.
rest of the week.
All
Yeah.
right. Okay,
Okay.
likewise. All the best,
Bye
everybody.
bye.
Good night.